Thank you. Thank you, Helen. And good afternoon, and thank you all for attending our first autumn webinar. As Helen just noted, I'm Victoria Melendez, a JASA Program Committee member, working with Amy Poster, Allison Tolman, and Leah Robinson. For those of you who are new to JASA, the organization promotes the study and appreciation of Japanese art and is celebrating its 50th anniversary. In connection with this celebration, JASA organized a major exhibition entitled Meiji Modern, 50 Years of New Japan, that opened at the Asian Society in New York in October, went on to the University of Chicago Smart Museum, and then to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, where it just closed on September 15th. We hope that you had the opportunity to see this extraordinary exhibition and the beautiful catalog accompanying the show, which is still available for purchase through the JASA website. Now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce today's speaker, artist Paul Binnie. Paul began his career in Scotland, where he studied art history at the University of Edinburgh and painting and etching at Edinburgh College of Art from 1985 to 1990. After taking his master's degree, he moved to Paris and then on to Tokyo in 1993 to study woodblock printmaking for almost 6 years. In 1998, Paul then moved to London, where he worked for 20 years, and he is now working in San Diego. Paul's work is widely held in many public collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C., the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the British Museum in London, and the National Library of Australia, Canberra, amongst others. Thank you again, Paul, for your lecture. And now I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here. Thank you, Victoria. And good evening to everyone who's listening. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to give momentarily. And in fact, the summary that Victoria gave was really excellent because it basically introduces more or less what I'm going to talk to you about. I was born in Scotland, and I'll go into detail about my artistic life and my training both as a painter and as a printmaker in the years from 1967 when I was born until now, when I now live in San Diego. You'll see behind me is my studio, and I'm talking to you from there. But I'm going to dive straight into the presentation. So here is the PowerPoint, which I've called Pigments of the Imagination. So as I said before, I was born in Scotland in 1967 in a small town called Alloa in the centre of Scotland. It's in the lower Highlands, the southern Highlands of Scotland. It's a small town or large village, and my family's been there for many years. I graduated from high school at 18 and went to Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland, to Edinburgh College of Art. And I did a joint major, a double major, at Edinburgh College of Art and Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh, from September of 1985 to 1990. On the screen, along with that information, is also a self-portrait. This is actually my first oil painting, and it was a self-portrait that I did in 1985 when I was 6 years old. So this slightly unusual image of a 16-year-old is a little bit of a taste of what's to come later on in the presentation. But let's continue on to this second image. This second image was actually done 2 years later. This is done in 1987, and is a painting of one of the models at Edinburgh College of Art. So I studied Edinburgh College of Art. The second line here says fine art, including drawing, painting, and printmaking. And I did those plus the printmaking, of course, in those days was etching. I've become known since then for Japanese woodblock printmaking, but in those days it was definitely etching that I was doing as well. But I also studied history of art, and the history of art part has become the thing that has helped me with a lot of the subsequent work that I've done, because I was very interested as a student in Japanese art. And actually, I got into that because I learned quite a bit about Impressionism. And of course, most of the Impressionist artists were either interested in or collected Japanese prints. There are famous collections made by people like Monet and Van Gogh that still survive, but I think all of the other Impressionists were looking at and collecting Japanese art. I was interested in that connection, but I was also interested in looking at Japanese prints for themselves. And that started a really passionate interest that obviously has continued until today. One of the main things that I do nowadays is woodblock printmaking, and I'll start to talk about that a little bit later on when I talk about moving to Japan to study. But I still also continue to paint and do drawing quite regularly. So I was trained, first of all, as a painter and draftsman, and that continues today. In fact, I think it's very important for anyone who does printmaking to also be comfortable, at least with being a draftsman and being a painter. So next, there we are. Sorry, I'm slightly learning this as we go on. So while I was a student, I did a number of summer trips to France. I was quite lucky that I was able to, I learned French quite young, and I was able to speak French. So I would often go in the summertime to spend 2 or 3 months in France during the summer break from university and college. I did a lot of painting there and traveling around. And illustrated on this page is a self-portrait I did in 1985. Again, this was my first year at art school. I was 18 at this time, and obviously quite looking at expressionist work, looking at a lot of different sorts of things in expressionism. But the important part that I wanted to mention too was my degree show. So I had a degree show at the end of my time at Edinburgh, which contained quite a number of male nudes, and those caused a bit of a problem for me. And actually 4 of the pieces were removed from my degree show, which was kind of a surprise, I think, to me and probably to everyone else, because the nude show on the previous slide was one of the things that I'd been doing as a standard part of my art study. I mean, we use life models a lot at Edinburgh, and for the degree show to have things removed came as a real surprise. So with that background, I had already partly thought about it, but I decided that I would then go and spend time in France after the degree. Of 19 watercolors, pastels, all different sorts of things. But I was definitely developing an interest in Japanese print. As I said, I'd been really interested in the way that print was influential on the work of the Impressionists, but also I started to collect Japanese prints. I bought my first Japanese print in the late 80s when I was still a student. And then in the early 90s, when I was living in Paris, I actually had access to a lot more Japanese prints than I'd had previously. In Scotland, there were not many prints available for sale, but in France, there were quite a lot. So although I hadn't really started thinking about the possibility of making prints, I was definitely looking at a lot of prints. Paris has a wonderful museum, the Musée Guimet, which is the Museum of Asian Art. And their collection is very interesting. It's arts of all of Asia, but they do have a good print collection. Plus, in those days, there were quite a number of galleries that were selling prints, and you could find prints even in flea markets. So I definitely spent a lot of time going around flea markets and looking at different places where I could encounter and learn from Japanese prints, plus collect them. Collecting was a major part of the thing that I was interested in doing. As time went on, in the 3 years, nearly 3 years that I lived in Paris, I definitely started to think that print was becoming more and more important to me. And Japanese prints with the techniques that they had were a thing that I was very interested in learning about. So in the early part of 1993, I decided to go to live in Tokyo. And through a connection, I decided then to move to Japan. I had a good friend from my university days who was doing the JET program, the Japanese English teaching program in northern Japan. And I decided to hop on a plane and go and see him. And so 1993, I decided to do that and moved to Tokyo. So in total, I lived in Japan for almost 6 years, from February of 1993 to November of 1998. And as this slide says, it was my beginnings in woodblock print. These two images on this slide are actually the very first prints that I made when I lived in Japan, two versions using the same blocks, but they became two different designs. And this was right in the beginning, 1993 and on the left and 1994 on the right, two versions from the same blocks. The first thing that I discovered when I went to Japan was that it's not so easy to learn about Japanese woodblock printmaking. I'll talk a little bit later about how I actually studied, but when I first got there and I was staying with my friend in northern Japan for a couple of weeks, I was looking around to see anything that was possible to learn about Japanese printmaking, and really not very much was available. Of course, you know, we were in the countryside and it's not a metropolitan area like Tokyo. But when I moved to Tokyo, even then, it was quite difficult to access information about woodblock printmaking. And I realized that the possibilities that I thought I might have at the start were a bit less, perhaps. However, this print was made in the version on the left, as I said, in 93, and on the right in 94. I went to Kabuki, and I'll talk a little bit more about Kabuki in a moment. But I went to Kabuki for the first time within a couple of weeks of moving there. And I saw the Heron Maiden, Sagi Musume, which is what these two prints depict. And I felt that there was a possibility of using a subject that had been around for hundreds of years and has been depicted by many artists. So I thought it was time that I should do something that connected with that historical past. So because my woodblock printing was in its complete childhood and I really didn't have much sense of technique, I then decided that the best way to do it would be to try stencil printing. So at this point, I was looking at woodblock and starting to learn how to do it, but I also had already done some kinds of stencil printing in the past. And there is a technique called Kappazuri. And Kappazuri is a traditional Japanese printing technique. It was actually originally developed for decorating kimonos with different colored patterns. And I thought this is something that I could use myself to make prints. Now, it was created in the Minge movement in the 1950s and 60s as an art style. And in fact, famous practitioners like Mori Yoshitoshi and so on used this as their printing technique. But I wanted to do it in a slightly different way, not quite the same as they had done. So I was looking at it more from my own training as a Western printmaker, and decided to use the kabuki that I'd experienced to make that the subject for various prints. So the print that you see in front of you is Kagekyo from the series of the famous 18 plays of the Danjiro line. And it was made in 1994 using Kappazuri stencil. And in the next slide, this print was one of the biggest prints that I made in Japan, actually, again with a stencil print. And it's called the Genroku Mi or Pose from the play Shibaraku, and shows the main character standing with his sleeves being held out by stage assistants to give the broad shape that this pose demands. This was made on a full sheet of Japanese paper, which is actually really very, very large indeed. And I used a number of techniques in it which were not used traditionally in stencil printing, such as the spattered background, which was done with a spray so that I could get that gold background. And because of the large size of it, it was made in a very, very small edition. This print was made in an edition of only 25. And I think there were only 2 art proofs or 3 artist proofs in addition to that. So really a very small edition. And in fact, in the early days, I was mostly doing very small editions for these stencil prints, which are quite labor intensive when it comes to printing, although they don't demand the same techniques as were needed for the woodblock prints. But talking of woodblock prints, there are also quite a number of woodblock prints of Kabuki. And these 2 are 2 of the popular designs that I did once my techniques had really started to come together, and I was much more confident about making woodblock prints themselves. On the left-hand side, we've got Fuji Musume, or the Warrior Maiden, and it was Nakamura Jakuemon, sorry, and he was the model for this in 1997. And on the right-hand side is a print called Nikidanjo with Ichikawa Enosuke as the actor for this. And that was 1996. So 96 and 7, I'd started, by this time I was definitely making woodblock prints more than Kappazuri prints. Kappazuri is great, but they're quite time demanding in terms of printing, whereas woodblock prints are more time demanding in terms of carving. There's a lot of carving to be made, but printing is fairly straightforward. So I moved on to doing a lot more woodblock printmaking from about the middle of my time in Japan. And that, after about 3-ish years or so, I was definitely making a lot more woodblock prints. However, I was also continuing to make oil paintings. And this relates back to the slide just before, which was the character in Shibaraku. This is the same character. His name is Kamaguro no Gongoro, and he's wearing here that same costume, but without the sleeves being held out by stage assistants. So when he first appears on stage, he actually walks onto the stage through the audience on the Hanamichi, which is a raised walkway. And he has the sleeves held out by a couple of long pieces of bamboo, almost like a kite. And they're enormous. You can see by this that the square shape that is in the center, which is his kamon, or his personal crest, is enormous. And the sleeves actually touch the ground from his shoulders. So these are used as quite a graphic device on the stage by the actor. This is actually Matsumoto Koshiro in the role. The previous Koshiro, his son has since taken that name, but this is the previous Koshiro who was in that role, Koshiro the Ninth, who was in that role in 1995. So I do woodblock prints, Kappazuri prints, and oil paintings of Kabuki. And the oil paintings, fewer in number than they also relate to another aspect of the painting life in Tokyo, which is the oil paintings. So I did a whole series of over 100 paintings of stage. And when I lived in Tokyo, I actually lived very near to the National Noh Theatre in Sendagaya. And I was very lucky in being able to go to see Noh almost every month. I was definitely in the Kabuki every month. And almost every month I would go and see different performances of Noh theatre as well. Now, one of the great things about Noh is it's very slow. So you have plenty of time to sketch from the character on the stage and to get the costume and the poses and so on while you're sitting quietly in the audience with a sketchbook. And so it was a great place to be able to create ideas for making oil paintings. So these two on the left-hand side, the play is Izutsu. This was painted in 1998. And on the right-hand side, Sumiyoshi Mode, or a trip to Sumiyoshi Shrine. And that dates from 1995. So during the time that I was very involved in Japanese theater, I was doing both prints and paintings of both subjects, particularly woodblock prints of Kabuki, but also oil paintings of Noh. And there's one more Noh oil painting here, this one of Dojoji. This is one of the most recent things that I've sold, actually. I had this in my studio until fairly recently here in San Diego, and I recently sold it to a prominent collector on the East Coast near Washington, D.C. it's about life size. So it gives you an idea of the scale of that painting. It's really very, very large. And in fact, I had borrowed the costume and the mask and the accessories from a friend who was a Noh performer. And I set it up in my own studio, not using an actor, in fact, as the model, but using the props that would have been seen on the stage. So this one was painted live in the studio. The others were painted from sketches that I did in theatre. So we've talked oil paintings, and I've mentioned that I did Kappazuri prints in my early career. So I'm going to swing back anti-chronologically to have a look at Kappazuri in a different subject. One of the things that I did from my early time in Japan was I was very interested in tattoo as a subject. And by complete chance, I was very lucky to find that the Sento, not far from where I lived, was actually owned by Yakuza, which are the so-called gangsters of Japan. I mean, I say so-called because they're very often just very ordinary, low-level kind of functionaries within that gangster world. Some of them are very nice and very easy to talk to. And I, by chance, went to the public bath with a friend, a Japanese friend. And as soon as we entered here, he said, "We have to leave. This place is run by Yakuza." At which point I said, "Well, listen, you go and I'll see you later. I want to stay." So I stayed. I met a couple of men who were covered in tattoos. And it really kickstarted a strong interest in tattoo as a motif in my print work, as well as my painting work. This print that's on the screen now, Carp, Koi, was actually not done from a genuine Yakuza. It was done using a friend of mine as a model, and I imposed on him this tattoo design with the carp. I chose several typical tattoo designs and brought them together into a single pose. Wasn't necessarily directly done live from a person who had these tattoos, but it was done entirely to make an artistic choice. Then later on, I'll talk about another series where I've done exactly the same thing, taking the idea of a particular artist and putting those into tattoos on the body. But in this case, this one, Carp, again, was one of those larger prints, not quite as large as the Shibaraku, the Genroku Mie that I showed you before. It's about half of that size. So it's half of a full sheet of Japanese paper. And like the very first Kappazuri print that I showed you, it's also on black paper. And I found that working on black was a great way to get a sense of shading into it, rather than putting shading on as the last color. Typically in woodblock print, you'll work from lighter colors to dark. In Kappazuri prints with black paper, you're working from dark to light. So I would work thinking of the black paper as the black tone and then putting various lighter colors on top of that, usually working towards the lightest in that case. I was at the same time also interested in doing woodblock prints, also on the theme of tattoos. And the one on the screen now is it's called Ryuni Oni, which means behind the Oni mask. No, it's not. Sorry, I've got completely the wrong image. This one's called mental blank. Urahanya, sorry, my mistake. Urahanya, I've written down the wrong title. Urahanya, behind the Hanya mask. I'm reading it underneath the print. That's not the same title. So this one was done using a model again, and he didn't have this tattoo on him. The tattoo was actually added from a separate woodblock and hand-colored in this case. And this woodblock allows us to talk a little bit about technique and also about my training. So I mentioned before that I went first to Japan and started doing woodblocks almost spontaneously. But I did also have an introduction to Yoshida Toshi, who was still alive and still working in Tokyo at that time. And a friend of mine who was a print dealer had given me a letter of introduction to go and see him, which I did. And I asked if I could work with him in his studio at that point. Unfortunately, I didn't know at the time, but he was very ill and was not taking things. So he said to me, I can't really help you, but I can put you in touch with Seki Kenji, who was the head printer of Doi Hanga 10. Now, Doi was an interesting the secondary publishing house. They published some designs by Hasui. They also published quite a lot of prints by other shin-hanga artists like Koitsu and, you know, people of a sort of middling level of shin-hanga. He was a very, very nice man. He was living in retirement at that point, and I went to see him with a recommendation from Toshi Yoshida. And he said to me he would take me on as an apprentice, but only because Mr. Yoshida had said so. And I was obviously very glad to get the education that I got. He allowed me to come and work with him in the studio 5 days a week, usually in the morning, starting quite early. And I would go there. He lived out at Kichijoji, which is in the east side, the west side of Tokyo. And I would go there very early in the morning, and I'd tidy up the studio before he started, which was the upper floor of his house. And we would work together, and he would give me simple things to do. First of all, I mean, you know, you have to learn from the very basics. So I learned how to sharpen the knives. I learned how to prepare brushes. I learned how to make sure everything was kept clean, preparing the paper, sizing the paper for work so that it was going to not allow the colors to bleed, and so on. I mean, so many simple and very basic things that you have to learn as a printmaker. So Seki-san was definitely the main person to teach me all about traditional Japanese woodblock printmaking. And I was with him off and on for the whole nearly 6 years that I lived there. At the same time, I also want to mention Ralph Kidgell, whose name appears here too. Ralph Kidgell was an English-born printmaker, and he had been working making prints before I knew him. In fact, he started printmaking, I think, some years before me. But at the time, he was actually also studying at Tama Bijitsu Daigaku, so Tama Fine Art Academy, University rather, and he was learning all kinds of like modern techniques in woodblock printmaking. And in fact, I put this up with this particular slide because Ralph helped me by teaching me the jigsaw printing technique. So the saw that is used to make jigsaw puzzles can also be used to cut wooden boards to make woodblock prints. So in fact, the print on the left-hand side is a jigsaw print. So all of the pieces of wood to make it are cut from a single piece of wood, a very thin piece of wood that's cut and inked up separately and then printed to make a single image. Now, this was a technique that Ralph used himself quite a lot. And in fact, he literally was standing by my side when he taught me how to do it. So this one was done under his direct supervision. And I will say that I added the tattoo as a last motif. And in fact, on this version, there's a fundoshi, the underwear, which is also added because the original version of this is a nude. And some people didn't really want to see it nude. So there is a fundoshi version as well for those who are a little bit squeamish. However, there is also an interest in fundoshi in this print. So this is the one that I initially mentioned earlier when I said Ryuni Oni. This is Dragon and Demon. So this is an example of a much more traditional woodblock print. This is a multi-block print. The outline is printed in a kind of bluish gray color. And so that gives us the outline of the tattoo of the dragon and the demon on his back. And then all of the other colors are from separate blocks printed onto it one by one, usually starting from lightest through to darkest. So the difficulty with a multi-block print is that you need an awful lot of wood, but the difficulty with a jigsaw print is that the ink has a tendency to dry very, very quickly when you're working on it. So that you've got to be very fast about inking and printing. Whereas with a multi-block print, that's not obviously a problem. It's much quicker, printing one color at a time, and then the next color and the next color, and so on. This is an example of again of a jigsaw print that I did directly with Ralph, and this one's a fun one because I did it in two distinct versions. This version is called Sleeping Girl, and it was printed when I lived in London in 2004. But in fact, I carved the block with Ralph in 2007. and it was originally a boy. A number of people had said to me, "Oh yeah, we really like that. He looks like a girl. Could he not be a girl? Wouldn't it be better for him?" So this is a print where the subject decided to have sex change in the middle of the process. So very few examples exist of it as a sleeping boy, and quite a large edition exists as a sleeping girl. Again, using woodblock print. So the upper blue area and the lower blue area are cut from the main block, and then the darker blue in the face, some of the details such as the eyebrows and the eyes are inked onto the flesh color block, and hair is inserted in separate blocks in. So the white line is just a V-shaped gouge to take out a line to give us a white line design. Slightly reminiscent of the San Francisco prints of the 1920s and 30s that were using a similar but different technique called white line printing. It was definitely a much more Western style print than traditional Japanese woodblock print. However, I mentioned that this particular version was made in London, and in 1998, I moved to London. I had lived in Japan at that time almost 6 years, and I felt that I had a great time, but I felt my career needed to move on. And I ended up living in London almost 20 years, well, in fact, 20 years, from November 1998 till December 2018. And they brought in a new subject to my work that I hadn't dealt with before, which was Bijin-ga. And Bijin is a Japanese word for a beauty, usually interpreted as a female. And this particular Bijin is from a series that I did called The Four Seasons. This is summer, and was the very first Bijin print that I ever made. In fact, this Four Seasons set was made on commission for a collector. And I began with this one. Then the second one in the series was spring. And they're obviously winter and fall along as well afterwards. These were made, as I said, for a collector, but they were also sold through a dealer. And what we found was that people had a real interest in the subject of Bijin. And of course, I always knew this. I knew people love prints of pretty girls. So shortly afterwards, I decided to make a different series, which is called Azumanishiki Bijina Wase, a collection of Eastern brocade beauties. And this was to be a series incorporating a lot of the things that you see in traditional Japanese prints, but maybe in a more modern way. So this particular design, butterfly bow, is of a girl, her seijinshiki, so her adult day ceremony, fixing her hair whilst wearing a kimono. And the bow at the back is tied in a traditional butterfly motif. She was the first in that series. This one of the Maiko in Kyoto, that was from 2000, sorry, previous one, 2005. This is also 2005. This was done after a trip to Japan and seeing the Maiko, the apprentice geisha, on the streets, chattering to each other as they were walking along. And I got a wonderful image of those with the hair, the beautiful hairstyle seen from behind and then seen from front. So beauties became a subject I went back to quite regularly at that time. And this particular print, Lingering Dream, Yume no Ato, is actually a version of an existing design that I did a short time before. This print was made 2008. Just before that, a year or so before, I made the same blocks, but in a different version with a tattoo. So variations on existing woodblocks I put up as the title for this, because very often I've taken things that have a possibility of being in more than one color scheme. So here she exists without a tattoo. There is also a tattoo version of this same print design. And starting to think about variation brought me to the current series of beauties that I'm working on right now, which is called Hyakunen no Hana, Flowers of 100 Years. This was the first in the series of Hyakunen no Hana, the 100 years, and it started in 2012. It was a frontispiece illustration of 1900, and I've done decade by decade the different eras of Japanese art during the 20th century. Now, in this series, I was less interested in purely decorative and was much more interested in telling a little bit of a story about the way that women's lives have progressed and have changed during the 20th century. And this one is, first of all, about literacy. She's holding a copy of a literary magazine called Bunge Kurabu, which was one of the most popular literary magazines. And it always had an illustration inside it with woodblock printed design, very often of a female subject, because the readership was mostly female. So this is a sign that at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, people were entirely literate. Universal literacy was Japan's main idea at that point. Another print from this series is a modern girl of 1920, and the suggestion here is that she is enjoying her life. She's out on the town and she has a couple of cocktails. She is escaping from the patriarchal society that would have her stay at home and be a serious housewife. She's able to go and live, enjoy her own life, and to spend her own money, probably meeting with a companion in a nightclub. This series, as I say, continues. The most recent one is this print, Bubble Era of 1990. And of course, I lived in Japan in the 90s. So all of the references in this are things that I knew myself. And I got a model here in San Diego to model for this figure, set in a nightclub at the time of the bubble era, the period before Japan's economy collapsed in the mid-90s. And she's set in a nightclub known as Juliana's Tokyo, which was the place to be seen, where champagne cost many thousands of dollars a bottle, and women would dance with feather fans. So it's about, the economy of Japan in an absolute boom at that time, but heading towards a collapse. So we now move on to, I mentioned earlier about tattoos. I mentioned that in tattoos, I had very often done images that were not on the actual model. And this series, The 100 Shades of Ink of Edo, Edozumi Hyakushoku, has been all about different artists' prints using tattoo. This one is Yoshitoshi's Ghosts. And I've chosen artists that had particular subjects and made them their own. Hokusai and his waterfalls. So these are all landscapes, 4 different landscapes that Hokusai made as waterfall prints, but imposed on the figure as tattoo designs. And talking of landscapes, this is one subject that I haven't really mentioned yet. I do still do landscapes. I've done them in the past. And this one is a famous view. So meisho is a word for famous views. I did a series of famous views of Japan before. But the current series that I'm still working on nowadays is called Travels with the Master. And this relates back to my interest in Yoshida Hiroshi and his work. He's an artist that I've always admired. And I've followed him to various places where he did a view, and then I've done my own version of it. So Yoshida's print of the Grand Canyon is very famous. I went there and did the design in 2004 and made the print in 2007. He also went to Niagara Falls. He took an entirely different view, actually, of just the horseshoe falls that you see at the upper part of this print. I did this print, including the American Falls, back in 2006. New York. He went and did a very small print of the New York view of the Woolworth building. And it became one of his smaller pieces. And I decided to do this in 2 versions. There's a New York sunset and there's also a New York night. And they were both done with the same building in the center of the print that he used himself, as I say, the Woolworth building. In 1924, when he went there, it was the tallest building in the world. Obviously far surpassed by the time I went to see it. And this print was made back in 2008. As I say, this is a continuing series. This is the most recent print from the series, Pittsburgh Night. Again, Yoshida did a small print of this design. And what I've done with this series, on the left-hand side, you'll see the title at the top is my characters saying Meisho to no Tabi, Travels with the Master. But below that, the actual print name, which says Pittsburgh no Yoru, so Pittsburgh Night, is actually Yoshida's handwriting, and I've lifted it directly from the prints that he made at each of the places that he went to. So landscape, the last landscape thing that I will mention, I moved to San Diego in 2019, January of 2019, and still live here now. And these two are landscapes of this locale. So on the left-hand side is a print called The Goat Trail of 2020. On the right-hand side, Summer Canyon of 2022. And these are part of the Sun Moon of Black's Beach, which are a series that I've been working on, often on both in oil painting and in print, in fact, since I moved here. So that basically rounds out how much I've been doing until now. Upcoming work. Obviously, I'm still a painter. I'll continue to paint as time goes on. But in terms of landscape, I just mentioned the Meisho Tono Tabi, the Travels with the Master series. I have a design for El Capitan, which Yoshida also visited in 1924. So that design will be coming soon. I started a new tattoo series recently called the Japanese Zodiac series. And that one is ongoing. The first design was released a couple of months ago, and the new design I'm test printing this very week. And there will also be at least 2 new prints in the Hyakunen no Hana, the Flowers of 100 Years series, with the 2 prints of 2000 rather, and probably 2010. I'd like to round it out into 12 rather than stopping at 11. So that really concludes my talk. And I think, I believe we're now going to open up to questions.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for this fascinating talk.
Thank you.
You covered a lot of territory over a short period of time.
It was a dash, 30 years of artwork in a moment.
What, as you look back on your career, what were the biggest challenges? For example, when you started studying woodblock printmaking in Japan?
I think, to be really honest, one of the main things was that I was so used to working in media that are very fast. Drawing and painting are comparatively quick things to do, whereas when you're working on woodblock print, you have to plan ahead and you have to be okay with however long it takes to do that. So in terms of planning a design, I know that when I start a new woodblock print, it's going to be at least 4 months until it's really ready. It can be more, and often, you know, for a serious print with lots of colors, it's more. I mean, typically nowadays, the prints that I make are somewhere between 20 and 40 colors. So the number of printings that takes is substantial, and it means a certain amount of time, both carving the blocks and making the final print. So it definitely, it taught me patience. There's no question that you have to learn to be patient. That was the main thing, I think.
Well, patience is a great thing in your case. And Daryl Carl has written a question. He said, Paul has had printmaking studios in Tokyo, London, and San Diego. He knows climate and weather can affect the printmaking process. Did you have to make any changes or adjustments in the way you printed in different cities?
Actually, Daryl brings up a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point, because in fact, I did a demonstration of woodblock printing in February in New York. Obviously it was the depth of winter and it was very dry, very, very dry. And the demonstration that I did was for my most recent print. In fact, I've got, I'm just going to show it on the screen. I've got a copy of it here beside me. So this, whoops, I can do that. Wait, there we go. This print is the first of the series of Japanese tattoo series that I mentioned. And this was printed partly in New York. And it was so dry in New York that the block I was working on dried out as I was working. So literally, it was curving and curling because the block was damp underneath and dry on top. So I did have problems with registration in that case. In my own studios, I'm very careful about controlling the humidity and the temperature and so on, so that is less of a problem. But in that situation, I was working in the New York Armory, and I had no control over how dry it was inside the building. So I was kind of struggling against the elements of that. So definitely keeping an eye on the humidity and the temperature are very important. Very, very important. So wherever I've lived and had a permanent studio, I've always been very careful about that. I'm lucky because San Diego has really excellent weather, and the weather here is perfect. It's mild most of the year. It's never exceptionally dry, and it's rarely very, very humid. So that printing is fine for that. That's no problem.
Excellent. Another question was, did you have any solo or group shows in Japan? I know you have them.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I took part in quite a number of group shows as both a painter and as a printmaker, in fact. And I think about 95 or 6 was my first group shows there. Somewhere on my curriculum vitae is my exhibition list, and it mentions a couple of group shows and solo shows that I did at that time. I did a solo show in the gallery at the Tokyo American Club in 1997, so the year before I left Japan. And it was basically a summary of my printmaking up until that time, with 1 or 2 watercolors as well. And you know, it had a large number of the things that had become quite well known from my time in Japan in that exhibition.
Thank you. Great. And are any of your prints in Japanese museum collections or Japanese private collections?
Oh, Japanese private collections, yes. Quite a number of my buyers have been Japanese over the years, and especially when I lived there, I was selling to quite a lot of Japanese buyers. Japanese public collections, I don't know. In fact, I don't think so. As far as I know, I don't know of any Japanese collections that have my work. But I think that's often the case because they tend to concentrate on different kinds of art for collections. You know, I tend to find that American and European collectors are very broad-minded. They'll look at the artwork much more than where the person comes from. Whereas I think a Japanese museum may be more concerned with representing what's happening in Japan itself. So, no, as far as I know, the answer is probably no to the Japanese public collections, but private, many.
That's interesting. You had noted previously some of the artists who influenced you. You mentioned Yoshitoshi, Hokusai, Yoshida. Any others? I mean, there's so many varied prints, and particularly, for instance, the Kabuki prints.
To be perfectly honest, I've appreciated all of the artists of ukiyo-e and manga. To be honest, I started collecting when I was around 20, but even before 20, and I was looking mostly at ukiyo-e. So I was looking at the artists of ukiyo-e that everyone knows and loves. So, you know, pre 1900, I liked all of those artists. I mean, as a collector, I could only afford some of them, but I liked them all. But when I started to seriously collect shin-hanga, you know, the art of the early 20th century, I was able to buy a lot of prints by artists that I really, really admired. And Yoshida would be the first of those because his work technically is extraordinary. And he came as a painter into printmaking rather as I did. I was already a painter before I started printmaking. And that I thought that was an interesting connection. I also loved Hasui. I loved Hasui's work a lot. But then I also like the artists who did Bijin prints, people like Shinsui and Kotondo. I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, there are very few Japanese artists that I don't like. I think it's easier to say the ones I don't like than the ones I do, because I've admired their prints and work for so long.
Wonderful. You talked a little bit about your training in Japan, and how you would go in every day and you learned sort of the basics. How did it evolve also? I mean, did you get specific training in different styles, or, you know, and you mentioned the stencil prints, but is that something you also learned from your teacher?
That's interesting. Well, so the stencil prints, no, I didn't learn stencil printing from Seki-san at all. And in fact, I went to a workshop very soon after I went to Japan about stencil printing and picked it up in about a day, because it's actually very similar to, you look a bit worried, but Victoria,
No. I'm looking at questions. That's why I was looking very.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I learned stencil printing in about a day from a day workshop that I did on how to do it. I'd already done some stencil printing before, because there's a style of printmaking in Europe called pochoir, which is basically stencil printing, and I'd done that already. Woodblock printing was very different. And so the style that I learned from Mr. Seki was definitely the shin-hanga style of woodblock printing. I didn't necessarily learn multiple styles. I learned the basic techniques of it. So learning to carve and learning to print. So he was very good because he was principally trained as a carver, but as a printer, but he was also a carver. And so he was very good at taking ideas and transforming them into woodblock prints and explaining how this could be broken down into different colors and different line effects and so on from a design. So Seki-san was definitely one of those people who knew the whole process intimately. He, as I say, he was retired when I knew him, and he had been working in the business his entire life. I mean, he'd gone to be a printer when he was in his late teens. And so, you know, from then until retirement, he'd basically been working in Japanese print forever. So he taught me from the start, like, as I mentioned, sharpening tools, preparing brushes, preparing the paper, and so on. And then he would give me little jobs like printing small areas that were simple to do on prints, or learning how to do bokashi shading by giving me a little bit more of a complex thing. So bit by bit, he brought me into the business of learning the process of printmaking by doing little steps and little steps. He was a very good teacher.
Oh, we have a question from Stephen Savage who asks, do you collect or have an interest in other foreign artists who made prints using Japanese techniques and perhaps Japanese subjects?
Yes, I do. So I mentioned my good friend Ralph Kidgel. Ralph was an artist that I liked very much. His style is very, very different to mine. But over the years, I bought work from him. I have a collection of about 40 or 50 prints that I bought from him over the years. Ralph unfortunately died a couple of years ago. And at some point, I would probably like to give the collection of prints that I have by him to an institution that would appreciate them, because technically they're so interesting. He was a constant innovator, a constant creator, and I like his work very much. He was actually trained in traditional methods, but he also went to, as I mentioned, Tama Bijitsu Daigaku, Tama Fine Art University, and he then learned all kinds of contemporary techniques. So great artist. And in addition to him, I have works by some of the well-known American artists who are also doing Japanese prints nowadays. Not many, but I mean, some of the things that they've made are great, and they tend to be large, and I don't always have enough wall space. But I do have some. Yeah, I still collect. So
Maurice Osman asks that you mention your own collection. Do you have any favorite prints that you go back to for inspiration?
You know, yes, that's interesting. So as I mentioned, I was working on this series, Travels with the Master, which was looking at designs by Yoshida. And I built a collection of Yoshida prints that was almost entirely complete. I think it was missing 3 or 4 designs, but he did some 260 odd prints, and I had almost all of them at a certain point. Those were the things that I really, really appreciated. I loved his work. I loved being able to handle it and see the different techniques that he worked on, and the way that he chose certain colors and did certain shadings, and so many of those things. Unfortunately, when I was moving to the US at the end of 2019, end of 2018, start of 2019, I needed to buy a house. So there was sadly no choice. I decided to sell the collection of Yoshida prints at that time. And the studio that you see behind me is the profit from having sold that collection. Because, you know, when you have a complete collection of woodblock prints, it becomes a lot of money. So I had bought them over a long number of years. I first started back in the 90s, early 90s, and then had to come to a very, very tough decision to sell them. But they were the reason that I have a house to live in now. So the choice was made. So although they were my favorite things, I did have to be a little bit serious. to decide. I mean, I do still have some prints. I don't have as many as I used to. Quite a number of things had to be sold.
One anonymous question is, what was the hardest printing technique that you learned from Seki-san?
It's a very good question. So actually, the one that I think is most difficult for people to learn in general is a mica application, because applying mica can be done in so many different ways. Like mica, for those who don't know, it is a very fine powdered mineral. It usually is either clear or slightly grayish, but it can be tinted with different pigments. And learning how to apply it means learning at least a dozen different ways to do it, because there are all different ways to do it for different effects. So Seki-san taught me an awful lot of ways. And since I've stopped working with him, I've also learned other ways that other people do it. So over the years, I've learned that mica is one of those things on prints that can be a real headache, but can look really wonderful. It looks great because it's a beautiful, shiny, sparkly surface, and that's very pretty. But it can be very difficult to apply it. So yeah, you can do lots of things. You can print the glue and then put the mica on. You can mix the mica to a paste. You can put color in so many things. But in terms of how it looks finally, oh, it looks wonderful, but it is a very difficult process to learn.
This is an interesting question from Colin Kimbrell, who asks, do you feel any difference in your mentality and approach in creating prints when living in Japan versus living abroad, given the inherent Japaneseness of the medium? Is it difficult to maintain that connection and authenticity?
You're right. That is a very good question. And I would say the answer to that is that I think the technique itself, while it is a Japanese technique, is not specifically tied to Japan. I mean, I very often use Japanese subjects, there's no question. But I also do things that are not necessarily Japanese in printmaking. And I very often look, for example, at the series of Travels with the Master. I'm looking at European or American scenes. I'm not looking at Japanese scenes. So the thing is, I think that the technique itself can be international. It should be international. Everyone should be able to do it. And well, I always say it's a Japanese learned technique. It is a Japanese technique. It's nonetheless done by a Scottish artist who is not Japanese. So, I mean, the fact is that I learned it in Japan, but I now practice it. And I've practiced it since 1998 outside of Japan, so that it has much more of an international connection than a strictly Japanese connection, I think. But still, I mean, I connect with Japan a lot. I have many friends there. I usually go to Japan every couple of years. So, you know, there's still a close connection. And I have a particular friend in Tokyo that I speak to every 2 or 3 weeks. So, you know, I'm in touch with what's going on in Japan quite a lot.
Well, we're lucky you are, and we're lucky to see your work and hear from you directly. Unfortunately, it's come on to 6 o'clock, so there are a couple of more questions that haven't been answered yet, but unfortunately we can't get to all of them. But we're so grateful for you and for your time and for your webinar, which will appear in a recorded fashion in a few days' time. So thank you so much again.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, it's been fun. In the meantime, I want to thank all of our participants for listening to today's webinar. And as I mentioned, a recording of which will be posted on the JASA website shortly. We also look forward to seeing you for the rest of the year. Our next webinar is on October 22nd at 5 p.m. Eastern Time with Claudia Orenstein, who is professor of theater at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of City University of New York, who will provide an introduction to Bunraku, the puppet theater of Japan. So until then, have a wonderful rest of the month, and we look forward to seeing you in October. Bye for now.